My name is Ingrid Appelqvist. I am from CSIRO Agriculture and Food. The purpose of this webinar is to demonstrate and discuss the importance of innovation and conducting long-term R&D to future-proof the red meat industry. The webinar will be split into three parts. The first will be around the megatrends, and this will be introduced by Dr Stefan Hajkowicz. He is from our Insights group and from Data61. That will be followed by James Dod, who is in our global team, and he will talk about the Australian innovation dilemma. And finally, I will follow with giving a number of examples of true innovation which has had a great impact on the agricultural industry, including one for the red meat industry. And now over to Stefan.
Thank you very much for that, Ingrid. So my name is Stefan Hajkowicz. I'm a Senior Principal Scientist at CSIRO working in the area of strategic foresight, where we analyse long-term trends and patterns of change, risk scenarios, bring it back to the current time to help an organisation make wiser strategic choices about where it should go. Now, about a year or so ago, we did an interesting project into the future of Australian agriculture and global food supply chains, which has many crossovers to the red meat industry, and I want to get into describing some of the results we found. Now, the narrative of the future that I'll be presenting to you today is based on the concept of megatrends, and this is a method and approach that we've developed, and it is used quite heavily in strategic foresight. A megatrend is a trajectory of change taking an industry to a very different place to where it is today. It builds gradually, but eventually expresses itself with explosive force, putting things into a very different space. Now, to identify a megatrend, I analyse political, economic, environment, social and technological trends, and where these coalesce and combine to create that more significant trajectory of change. That's where we have the concept of a megatrend. Now, we worked with RIRDC, the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation, to do an analysis of megatrends. And in this next slide here, we can see that there are 5 that we've identified for agriculture and food. The first of which we call a hungrier world, and this is about the sheer increase in the amount of calorific intake that the world needs to feed itself. A growing population and increasing rates of per capita calorie consumption means a lot more food needs to be made to 2050, and there's growth in agricultural markets. A wealthier world then looks at what the effect of income growth is, as incomes will grow from some 14,000 GDP per capita today up to 44,000 GDP per capita by 2060, according to the OECD long-range economic forecasts. Now, wealthier people eat different stuff. Protein consumption is on the rise. Diet diversification is all happening. So as I get into the presentation, I'll explain about what some of that means. The next megatrend is choosier customers. Health is a much bigger driver than it has been previously because of the diet and health issues that we've created in the West are getting replicated right across the Asia-Pacific region, and they're going to want food that responds to chronic illness and health conditions. But they also care a lot about provenance. Where did my food come from? This is more and more important for the food consumer, and I think we will continue to see food safety scares happen across the region, which require secure supply chains, and those producers that can put in place those secure supply chains that answer the question, where did my food come from, where is it safe, is it authentic? If they can put that together, they win these massive markets. The next one we call transformative technologies, as the next 10 years alone will see huge shifts in the technological capacity of agricultural producers. Big data analytics will change what's possible. Precision farming is something that is moving ahead in leaps and bounds as we can become a lot more precise with geolocation technology. Automation and genetics is also part of that story. The last of the megatrends we call a bumpier ride, which expresses itself in multiple ways. The story of climate change is well known, but we are also seeing the emergence of herbicide and pesticide resistance, which affects production systems. In addition to this, we are moving into a world with some uncertainties around global trade, as there is a possibility that countries are constructing walls, if not fences, around themselves to change the flow of agricultural produce. So there could be some shocks to the way the global markets operate in numerous ways. Let's jump into the first of the megatrends, which is a hungrier world here. And the statistic here that you can see is that using 2005 as a baseline, around 60 to 70% more food will be required to meet demand by 2050. This is because we have a world of more people. We've crossed our 7 billion persons threshold for the world. we level out closer to 10 billion people or possibly up to 12 billion people midway through the century, depending on what forecast we look at. Australia's population grows from 24 million to 32 million, so there's population growth and we know that people need food. So a huge increase in amount of calorific intake required. And Australia can't be the food basket of Asia. We can't make enough food for Asia, but we can certainly make more and respond to this growth story. The questions about whether or not the world can feed itself is this doable? Our senior researcher, Sandra Eady, who worked with me on this project, had a look at exactly that question and comes down to answer very much yes. Via innovation and improvements in agricultural production system, the world has absolutely no problem meeting these increased food production requirements, and historically has been able to do this. So we can even make fairly modest assumptions about future increases in food production capabilities. And yes, the world very much can feed itself, but it still doesn't detract from the size of this opportunity that simply has to exist. China had to sign a free trade deal with Australia on agriculture because it can't get enough food from inside China. So we're one of the countries that can supply that large market. The next dimension to this is a wealthier world. This is the next megatrend that we explore, and this slide here shows you the rice paddies in front of the city of Shenzhen in China. And it's a good juxtaposition of the two images because 20 years ago, Shenzhen was a lot more of those rice paddies. This city has been made in 20 years, and historically it took Europe 400 years to construct a city of this size, and is now a diversified, thriving economy with a tertiary sector, which is an incredible transformation in the space of only a couple of decades. And it wants food. The city that is being created there has been built on agricultural land, and it needs food from outside. It needs different types of food for a wealthier population. The next graph here shows us one of the key drivers of interest to livestock producers around the world is the increase in protein consumption. The line at the top there goes up and down a bit, but is fairly flat. And that's how many grams per day an Australian citizen on average will consume of protein. But if we look at the two lines lower down, we can see for world and Asia really strong growth in daily protein consumption rates. So, it's an inevitable consequence of wealth growth that we see a rise in the amount of protein being consumed. The next slide shows us specifically for beef consumption. The graph there for Australia is fairly flat, except for that massive spike in 1976 when beef prices really dropped during that period, associated with fluctuations in the global oil markets. And we can see beef prices go straight up and come back down again. But mostly they've been pretty flat there around how much beef consumptions Australia do. But look at the Asia graph and you can see a line that's just sloping almost at 45 degrees. So they're playing a catch-up game to where we are, and this is a pretty comforting signal if you are a beef producer. Now markets are priced in, and plenty of other countries can supply that beef to the Asia markets. But again, it points towards a growth story. I guess the other point to make on the wealthier customers is the diversification of diets. The diet of Asian people is not a bowl of rice anymore, which it historically was. That was one of their main staples. It is now a table spread that more closely approximates a Western table. We're seeing the emergence of nuts, fruits, veggies, milk, dairy products, and meats and fish as well. So there's a lot more different types of food on the table, and this is fantastic because this is key to the alleviation of malnutrition across the Asia region. It's not just how much food you eat, it's the diversity of food and different minerals and nutrients that are contained in that food. So we're seeing wealth associated with diet diversification. The next mega trend we call choosier customers, and this is quite a powerful one that is creating some really big opportunities, and we've seen some quite amazing developments in recent times about how global supply chains are really trying to deliver on this expectation for provenance. So let's look at what choosier customers mean. This is really a story of a customer who cares about the safety of the food product they're eating. They can afford to choose a more safe product. And we've seen this happen with New Zealand dairy products in China and now Australian dairy products in China. They're willing to pay a significant price premium because of a perception of safer, healthier products. We are seeing a customer that cares about just where did my food come from, what part of the world, what region was it produced in, to more granular levels than have historically been the case. So the FAO catchment zones you may see in your frozen fish products are good, but they show you a big chunk of the world and don't help you too much. I think we're moving towards wanting to know specifically and exactly where the fish product came from and then what happened to it on its way and how long it took to get to me. And that sort of technology is going to be in place, but that's the expectation of the customer, is to know those things. The other big angle on choosing your customers is health. We can see right across the world, not just in developed countries where it's more pronounced, but right across the world, obesity and overweight trends are on the rise. And it expresses itself in different types of genetic makeups for the different races and cultures across the world, but it's there as a fundamental challenge and problem. People are eating too much of the wrong sorts of foods, and it is having an effect in terms of cutting lives short. You know, the poor diet is a huge issue for premature mortality for people across the world. So people are going to turn to their food products to see what kind of benefits they get. I think that we will see growth in functional food products. We will see growth in the information demanded by the consumer about what does this product do that's good or bad for me. And the implication for industry is be ready to answer those questions. You know, we have through time seen the debates about, is salt good or bad for me? Is red wine good or bad for me? Is egg consumption good or bad for me? If you get online and start reading about these things, you'll see hundreds of opinions this way and that about what the case is. Eventually, I think science wins these arguments and pushes us into the space of knowing what is good or bad for us. But what it means for an industry, for the beef industry, is being able to answer those questions and convincingly about how the product influences health. But also, I think there'll be a shift towards functional foods. I don't want to just eat a food that's healthy. I want to eat one that's actually improving my health. There's functional food markets in Japan where the population is more aged. They will be 40% over the age of 70 by the year 2050. In that population, functional foods have really taken off. Dietary fibre, for example, is an enormous underdone benefit which can be part of a diet with red meat in it that leads to all sorts of benefits for human health and well-being. There is also, I think, the sustainability and ethics story, which will not go away. In fact, even though when we analyse China, we find just there's not much evidence of that market being very big at the moment, but year-on-year growth rates are significant. And as education levels rise and affluence rises in the region, there's every expectation that they will care about the ethics of food production, the sustainability of food production, and the producers will need to really be able to demonstrate these things as well. Transformative technologies is the next mega trend. This looks at data analytics, robotics, automation on the farm, which is all set to rise, but also the rise of genetics and synthetic materials. This next graph here shows us for cotton, wool, flax, cellulosic fibres, all compared against synthetic fibres here. And we can see at a global scale how quickly the synthetics are growing, because they're able to take costs down and have functional performance characteristics that often exceed those natural fibres. Now, the story could be similar for lab-grown meats or artificial meat production, which doesn't involve a cow. The stem cells are taken off the cow and the meat is grown in a petri dish. This is only being done experimentally at the moment, but pardon me, if costs do come down for that form of production, there's no reason why it can't scale up. And then the consumer yuck factor will come into play. Are we willing to eat meat created that way? Well, that's hard to answer, but researchers are tackling that question, and I think it could be quite interesting, the nature of shifts that can happen in consumer perception. Whether or not that's a risk is hard to say, but when there is a disruptor in your industry, you always want to bring that disruptor into the tent and understand it and then drive the disruption. You know, the response by the taxi companies to Uber should have happened in 2012. And they should have been building those same sorts of models. If these other technology-driven disruptions are there, we can see some evidence that they could be. The key objective for the industry is to be in the driving seat, to drive that disruption internally, and then it gets a far better outcome. Genetic production is also on the rise. We're seeing a huge increase in the amount of genetics in crop production around the world because of the superior performance of those crops in adverse environmental conditions, and this could be really important as climate change comes along, which takes us to the last mega trend, a bumpier ride. The climate change trajectories the world is on are shown here in these maps of the world. This shows us surface temperatures for the world from the period 1900 to 2016. I've taken the 30-year average from 1950 to 1980 and compared it against that, so we can see in the early decades there that the map is blue and green, showing it cooler than that long-term average. When we get to 1980 to 2000 and 2000 to 2016, it's lighting up yellow and red all over the place. And this is NASA satellite data that doesn't have too much modelling done to it. This is just temperature recordings. How hot is it down there? We know that 2016 is now going to be the hottest year on record ever for the world. As we approach Christmas, it's pretty well a done deal now. 2015 was the hottest year before that, and we've had 15 of the 16 warmest years on record since 2001. So climate change is absolutely happening in accordance with the long-range forecast to roughly a 1.5 degree hotter Australia through the midway through the century, with variation in rainfall and more extreme events. There is much that can be done in terms of engineering and crop production and pasture production systems that cope for this, and agriculture may shift towards more controlled environments where it can manage climate change. But it is certainly going to be a challenge for the production systems. The next one I'll point towards here is pesticide and herbicide resistance too. So the use of pesticides and herbicides on crops and pastures for beef production has eventually resulted in those pests and weeds becoming resistant, similar to antimicrobial drug resistance, which I'll talk about. And the diamondback moth, which damages crops such as broccoli, Brussels sprouts and cabbage, has resistance now to all modern insecticides. You can't spray it with stuff and kill it anymore. And there are plenty of weeds that are in a similar sort of situation. You've got to rip them up with a tractor to be able to get them out of the ground, which is a lot more expensive. So we are seeing some changes to the way Earth ecosystems operate, and we're starting to have to deal with some of those challenges. And again, we're looking for more manageable and structured environments for food production. The next slide is a look at antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and this is something I'm introducing into the narrative more recently, but has got to be one of the significant drivers for the world looking forward into future decades. And this is bacteria getting resistant to the antibiotics we use to kill them. Year on year, we have more species of bacteria which cannot be killed via any known antibiotic, and that's because over time they build up resistance, they evolve and find their way around it. So it will have implications for livestock production in that the US Food and Drug Administration guidance number 213 takes effect in 2017, and it aims to limit and manage medically important antibiotics in livestock production. It's going to be a challenge that the world looks at, given that global use of antibiotics for livestock was 63,000 tonnes in 2010 and will rise to 106,000 tonnes. That's 67% more by 2030 at current trends. So I think the world is increasingly going to look into this and how we can do livestock production with fewer or no antibiotics in some cases. It's because the more we put medical antibiotics out there, the increased fueling of resistance happens, and then when people get those infections, they can die from them. So the mortality rate has gone up. 23,000 people die every year in America as a result of these infections, and I don't yet have data for Australia, but I do know it is a significant and early emerging issue. We're also seeing the antibiotic pipeline dry up, and that for the last 30 years we haven't seen a whole new class of antibiotics put out onto the marketplace by pharmaceuticals. So I think this one is going to feature. The last set of trends, wasn't part of that original story we did for Reddick around turbulence in the global economy, but I don't think we can look at Brexit and the US election and come to the conclusion nothing is going on that's different. Something different is happening in global politics. This slide here shows us income growth across the world over the last 20 years, and we can see that in the developing economies there's been really strong income growth over that period of 20 years, about 80% increase in their incomes. The top very wealthy few in wealthy countries have also experienced very strong income growth, up to almost 80%. But the lower and middle income brackets in wealthy countries, Middle America for example, has not done well. They haven't had a pay rise for a very long time, nor has Middle United Kingdom, lots of Europe, Australia as well, where we're seeing wages flatline. And there is a response to this situation in that people want change and want to focus on the middle income bracket more than it has been. But that's going to be interesting as it results in some shifts and decisions that we would not have probably expected. But we're moving into a different world now. What that means for global trade is interesting, and there are possibilities that we see some of it close down. Maybe bilateral trade deals open up, but there could be a change in the flow of agricultural goods across borders, or different, not all bad, opportunities and also some risks for how that works. But I think we can expect some shocks to the system in terms of the global trade environment that we're moving into. So that's a quick snapshot of 5 megatrends that are reshaping the environment for agriculture. Just to recap of what they were, it's a hungrier world, a wealthier world, choosier customers who care about provenance, transformative technologies that will change the way we do food production, and a bumpier ride with some more signs for volatility associated with climate, pest and herbicide resistance, antibiotic resistance, and lastly the sort of geopolitical situation that the world is moving into, all showing more bumpiness. Thank you very much for your time, and now I will pass to James to continue the story.
Hello everyone, my name's James Dod and I'm the Global Partnerships Manager at CSIRO. I wanted to talk to you today about Australia's innovation dilemma and how we can use technology and innovation to address some of the concerns, challenges and opportunities raised by the megatrends that Stefan's just discussed. So technology is advancing at an ever-increasing rate. Over the last few hundred years, scientific output has increased by about 5% every year, with total global scientific output doubling about every decade or so. And if we plot the major inventions over time, what we see is that we saw an inflection point around the mid-20th century aided by new computing power, which has led technological innovation to skyrocket. And coupled with this, technology diffusion, the rate at which technology spread around the globe, has also skyrocketed. It took 75 years for the telephone to connect 50 million users. The radio achieved this feat in 38 years. But if we look in the more recent past, Twitter reached 50 million users in just 9 months. And even more recently, Pokemon Go reached this feat in 19 days. Now, I'm not saying that these are by any means equal inventions, but it just shows you how fast technology can now move and spread around the world. And this technology is changing everything. It's changing the way we live, the way we communicate, and the way we do business. You'll be familiar with many industries that have been completely disrupted by new technology coming in. Everyone's familiar with Uber, changing the face of transport and logistics. 3D printing is completely redesigning the manufacturing process, and the food industry is no exception. We're starting to see urban vertical farms pop up in cities to produce fruits and vegetables with virtually zero food miles. The prospect of lab-grown meat, which Ingrid will touch on a bit later, is really threatening the need for mass livestock farming. So what's happening in the red meat industry? So you might be familiar with a recent report commissioned by AMPC and performed by Ernst & Young, which identified 6 strategic risks to the red meat industry in Australia. And the industry is looking to R&D and in particular organisations such as AMPC to help mitigate and solve these risks to ensure that the red meat industry is sustainable and competitive on the global stage in the coming decades. The first risk was international competition. Australia is one of the leading beef exporters in the world, but faces stiff competition from developing countries such as India and Brazil. The industry needs to embrace new technologies to revolutionise our industry, boost productivity and reduce unit cost. Value chain integration. I think it's clear to say, or fair to say, that producers and processors have a fairly strained relationship at the moment. But we need to work on collaboration and trust between these two parties to bring benefits to the industry, and the industry needs to embrace technologies such as the Internet of Things to streamline the value chain and derive the most value for all participants. Social license to operate. You'll have seen in the choosy customer megatrend from Stefan that provenance and animal welfare are strong consumers' desires, and they are willing to pay a premium for their peace of mind. Climate change. A global problem Stefan touched in the bumpier ride megatrend. Producers can expect a stronger risk profile going into the future as extreme climate events become more and more common. And they'll need to use technology to predict, adapt and mitigate these events to ensure that their production is sustainable into the future. In changing consumption patterns, we've noticed that red meat consumption across the Western world has been decreasing as customers seek more humane and healthier options, and also a growing desire for quicker meals. The industry will need to look to technology to build trust with their consumers, to increase the health benefits and nutrition aspects of red meat, and also to develop animal welfare frameworks to allay these fears and hopefully counteract this reduction. Looking at the regulatory environment, there are strong risks here for closure of international markets and also higher red meat processing costs. The industry needs to build strong communication plans with their stakeholders and with regulatory bodies, and coupled with world-leading animal welfare frameworks, carbon footprinting and resource use to ensure they can withstand these risks and make sure that the Australian exporters are protected into the future. So this is just an array of risks that the red meat industry needs to protect itself, and AMPC is ideally positioned to protect this industry going forward. But what is R&D looking like in Australia? It's fair to say that Australia is facing a bit of an innovation dilemma. We're already struggling to get a good return on investment for our R&D dollar. If we look at the Global Innovation Index, which is an annual survey of innovation systems around the world, what we see is that Australia actually has very good innovation inputs. So we have the 12th largest R&D budget in the world. We have a good supply of world-class universities and research infrastructure, and a strong pipeline of researchers and students able to carry out this research. And this actually ranks us about 11th in the world for innovation systems. But then if we look at research or innovation outputs, so this is the number of publications, the number of patents, the number of spin-out companies that we create, our ranking drops down to number 27. And if we look at the ratio of these two, which is called innovation efficiency, the amount of output we get per unit input, our global ranking actually drops down to number 73, which is not a place where we want to be. And one of the key drivers of this is a lack of collaboration between researchers and industry, and that's actually a metric that we rank last in the OECD. And AMPC is ideally positioned between research and industry to help bring that lab-based research direct to industry and future-proof the red meat industry in Australia. So if you look how we want to do that, at CSIRO, we view research across 3 different horizons. Horizon 1 is your near-to-market research. That's how do we improve our core products and services and apply existing knowledge to immediate problems. In Horizon 2, we start to look into the future. What are the problems and issues facing the industry over the next 3 to 5 years, and how will industry adapt? Most of this is done through applying new and disruptive technologies and creating new prototypes and systems to address these problems. And in Horizon 3, this is your blue sky research. How can we do new things in ways that we've never even seen before? What does the industry look like in the next 10, 15 or 20 years? How can we create new and disruptive technologies for the industries of tomorrow? Ingrid and I recently did a project for AMPC where we did a review of the project portfolio at AMPC. And what we found is that the vast majority of research lies in Horizon 1, with a small amount of research projects sitting in Horizon 2, such as the robotic cutting prototypes. And what we fear is this is actually leaving the industry exposed to a risk of international competition or technology disruptors, because there isn't this backup or this pipeline of research in Horizons 2 and Horizon 3. So what we urge is that you increase the proportion of research in Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. So I'm now going to pass on to Ingrid, who will just take you through some case studies of Horizon 2 and Horizon 3.
Thank you, James. So I will now follow with some examples of research translation that has truly went into value-added products. I have 2 case studies, but before I mention these, I'd like to just show you some innovation that many of you will be familiar with that has been not only impacted nationally on Australia, but actually truly throughout the world. And of course, one of the biggest ideas and inventions that Australia should be very proud of is Wi-Fi, which of course everybody uses, has transformed everybody's lives. The other big innovation is around the polymer notes, which, as you know, everyone uses and we definitely all appreciate. The story that I want to cover is around Barley Max, which you can see as one of the examples here. And the reason why Barley Max is very important and why it was invented in the first place has really been because of the chronic diseases that Australia suffer from. As you know, being a developed country, we have a lot of burden associated with diseases such as cancers, cardiovascular disease, obesity. And really, a lot of these illnesses can be prevented by the types of diets that we have and that we eat. So one of the things that we wanted to develop and has started to develop many, many years ago was a more nutritious and healthy barley grain in which we could really use conventional breeding and develop a grain that would actually really have an impact on our health and well-being. So you can see that the innovation that we developed is right the way through the whole supply chain, so right from the barley grain itself, right the way through to the impact of the consumer. And a lot of R&D was required in order to make sure that right the way through the supply chain innovation was developed, so that at the end we actually had a product that we could put onto the supermarket shelf, and also to ensure that we had all of the science evidence to show that it was healthier and actually did impact on the health and well-being of the people that ate the product. So from the genetics developed in the grains, we got a barley grain that actually had twice as much fiber and 4 times as much resistant starch. Now, resistant starch is important for gut health. It allows the bacteria to ferment in the colon the starch, which in the end produces a gas which is actually very healthy for you, butyric acid. In doing so, when we produced the healthier grain, what happened was that then the amount of yield decreased. So there was a lot of research done on crop management to try and increase that yield gap. So again, a lot of R&D was invested in order to do that. Once we've got the grain and could grow it at the level that we needed to, we found that the grain shape was different to conventional barley, and so we needed to work with cereal manufacturers and actually partner with them and develop actually new processes that allowed us to mill this new grain so that the products could be developed and manufactured. Once this was all done and then we produced the product, the final part was actually to show clinical substantiation. So we did a lot of clinical studies in the background with cohorts of a number of consumers to demonstrate that in fact by taking barley max as part of your daily diet actually did improve your gut health. And then that was something that we found was great and did work. And then the final piece was that we needed to engage with the consumer and do a lot of sensory analysis, because while the grain might be healthier and the product healthier, we know that if it doesn't taste great, consumers are not going to buy it and repurchase it time and time again. So we had to really put an awful lot of R&D in the background to try to make sure that we could get this product from growing it in the field right the way through to sitting on the breakfast table with consumers right the way around Australia and indeed into export markets as well. So this is an example of where there's been quite a bit of impact from R&D investment. And the type of impact that you can see here is that it has benefited not just the growers who get more money for the grains that they've produced, but actually the producers and processors as well, because now they've got a product that is differentiated from everyone else, so they can ask for a premium price on it. And the consumers benefit because they've actually got a choice of a healthier product that they can have for themselves and for their family. Australia also benefits as well from this, because by having products that are healthier in general and giving consumers a healthier choice, that means that in general chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease or reduction in obesity can have a great impact in reducing the cost burden of these chronic diseases. And as you can see, we've estimated that around 305 million has been saved per year in reducing the incidences of some of these illnesses. And generally there's even more savings just per year in the fact that by increasing your dietary intake, you just reduce the general costs for the care system of Australia as well. The second example that I would like to talk to you about is around the Meat Standards Australia, and this is something that you will be perhaps a bit more familiar with being in the red meat industry. So this is, as you know, is the world's only food grading scheme that is specifically designed to guarantee the quality of the product from the organoleptic, from the sensory perspective, from the tenderness of the meat, the colour of the meat. No other country has adopted this Meat Standards Australia at the moment, but the rationale for having this system in place was because in the early 1990s, when in fact was beginning to be developed, a lot of consumers were moving away from eating red meat, particularly beef, because there was no standard quality, and they couldn't guarantee the quality of the product. So they often bought what they thought was prime steak, only to find that it was very tough and not at all up to scratch. And after a while, they just got fed up of having meat that was not of the quality that they expected. So this Meat Standards Australia was introduced in 1999, and it has had a great impact since being introduced. A lot of research underpinned this Meat Standard Australia, so it wasn't something that was designed over a short period of time. In fact, a lot of research done even much more in the early 1970s and 80s has been used to underpin this particular innovation. It required that it needed a lot of collaboration between different scientists, so that a lot of different disciplines, from genetics through to husbandry through to quality assurance, was required in order to be able to develop this idea. It also addressed major production from all different breeds of animals, and in fact is still more research is being done today as new animal breeds are coming onto the market. So it's an evolving innovation and invention, and is continually being updated as more and more information and more research is being conducted around animal breeds and relating that to quality. It's also high science that's been involved, so there's been a lot of peer-reviewed science, and it's actually won quite a lot of awards as well. So it also has a high status, which is important for the researchers, but also very good for the red meat industry as a whole as well, to be earning these prestigious awards. So the impact, as I mentioned, has been great. It was commercially launched in 1999. The value of the MSA since it was launched till 2006, and so it's much higher than there, has already been estimated to be around $244 million. It is again benefited right the way from the producers through the manufacturers and obviously to the consumers, who now have standard high quality meat that they can rely on. And it has also reduced and stopped the decline of eating red meat, particularly beef, from the early 1990s. So it has helped to wean people and consumers back on to eating red meat as part of their daily diet. So the final piece that I want to talk to you about is really around a research project that we are currently discussing with AMPC, and it's around the plasticity of taste, perception and preference. So this is really where we want to identify the level of genetics, your own genetics, so your blueprint, and that of the environment. So you know, your background, what experience you've had with eating red meat, how you were brought up, whether you were obese or lean, and how much of an impact that environment has had on your preference for eating red meat. So what we want to be able to do is understand to what extent we might be able to change preferences and wean people back onto eating red meat, and really getting an understanding of the attributes of red meat that drives consumer liking and perception. And we can do this in a number of cohorts, so we can start to look at Caucasian cohorts and Asian cohorts living in different countries, as well as those that are currently living in Australia. And what we hope to be able to find out is, from this work, is, you know, what are the preferences for these different populations of people that will allow us to be able to start to design products specifically for their palate in mind. And by doing this, we hope to very much change a trend and actually bring more people eating more and more red meat, who maybe starts to be weaned away by eating, for example, chicken and fish. And finally, I just want to end with reviewing a few things of looking at future foods for Stardate 2050. So this is really looking into the future. It's a bit of the sort of Star Trek and science fiction, but in any case, many of the examples that I've shown you in this slide are getting more towards science fact. So what we have already is ways that we might grow agricultural products, may well be not in farms and in fields, but actually in very large rooms where we can actually start to grow products one on top of the other in very controlled conditions. And there are already examples of such rooms around the world as well, as you can see. The way that we produce meat may not be through an animal. It may well be that we will be engineering meat analogues in the Petri dish, and there is already technology that allows us to do this. What this technology will allow in the future will be that we will be able to really design specifically for you as an individual your taste requirements and be able to produce a piece of meat that has everything that you need, whether it's the nutritional aspect, the functional aspect, the taste and sensory properties of that piece of meat, just designed especially for you. New protein sources are becoming more and more relevant as we get an increase in populations, especially in our region, the Asian region. And here we're showing protein coming from the insect world. And of course, as you know, in some cultures this is not very new. But for others it is, and it may well be that we won't be eating whole insects, but certainly we will be eating the protein extracted from those insects, and that protein will be developed into new products which will be designed for us as well. And I've also shown here that innovation in 3D printing of food, and it may well be that not long into the future every household might have a 3D printer, much the same as they have a microwave in their oven, to be able to print a meal designed again specifically for you. So this 3D printer may well interact with your wearable device, which will say something about your well-being of the day, what maybe nutrition you might need for what you have in store, whether you're going to run a marathon or whether you're going to be sitting at home. And we'll be able to print out a particular diet or food to enhance your well-being for whatever function you have or whatever you're going to be doing that day. And finally, automation is here with us already, and it's only just going to grow greater and greater. Many of our factories are already automated, the red meat industry. Many of the more dangerous functions are already taken over by robotic arms and robots in general. And I can see this trend's going to be coming more and more. And so we need to be able to think about what the future industry is going to be like, where we're going to have to interact and interface more with autonomous systems, whether that be robots working on their own in what we call dark factories, where there won't be any humans, or whether there will be interactions between a human and a robot working side by side in a range of factories within the meat industry. So you can see that there is a lot of change. There is a great opportunity for innovation, and I certainly know that the red meat industry is embracing these new innovations, and I am sure that by doing so they will be future-proofing, or you will be future-proofing your industry for many hundreds of years to come. Thank you very much.